David Adair, a gifted teenager with a knack for space engines at the age of just 17, found himself in a blast-sealed chamber beneath one of America's most restricted facilities. In front of him was an engine that he insists was not built by any aerospace program on this planet. For decades, Adair has claimed that he cracked the code on engineering spacecrafts in Area 51. Join us as we analyze his reports about a living reactor inside one of the world's most heavily guarded military facilities. It's time to tell the truth. The teenager who outperformed the adults. Let's start with how a 17-year-old kid ended up inside one of the most restricted military facilities in the country, because this wasn't luck, and it definitely wasn't a coincidence. By the time David Adair was in high school, he was building liquid fuel engines capable of reaching altitudes that forced local authorities to monitor his tests. According to his account, he was creating combustion systems powerful enough to scorch acres of pasture, pushing hydrogen-kerosene mixtures into ranges that didn't look like a hobby anymore. When most teenagers were trying to figure out their first car engine, Adair was designing systems that made the military pay attention. And this is where the first connection forms. You don't get this far without someone stepping in. For Adair, it was a combination of academic recognition, military curiosity, and political access. Congressman John Ashbrook took an interest in the young engineer's rapidly evolving work. Ashbrook wasn't a casual observer. He helped Adair secure funding, access, and oversight for his increasingly sophisticated rocket experiments. Not long after, retired Air Force General Curtis LeMay also became aware of the teenage engineer's designs. LeMay wasn't the type of man who wasted time. If he saw potential, the potential was real. And he didn't just observe from a distance. He visited, evaluated, and tracked the teenager's progress personally. This level of attention didn't happen because Adair was building faster rockets. It happened because he was building new kinds of rockets, engines rooted in an idea decades ahead of its time. Electromagnetic fusion containment. The concept was simple on paper but nearly impossible in practice. Capture a slice of star-level plasma inside a magnetic bottle and use that confined reaction as a propulsion force. Adair wasn't playing with metal tubes. He was designing around a concept that mirrored the logic behind advanced theoretical spacecraft propulsion. One detail from his testimony stands out. Adair describes how experts evaluated his math. People at Cambridge reviewing his work, even noting his brief academic interaction with Stephen Hawking. You need to understand this. Once someone demonstrates the ability to conceptualize high-energy fusion engines at that age, they're no longer just a talented kid. They are a strategic asset, and that's exactly what happened. When Adair built the prototype engine, when he finally had a rocket ready to fly, the people overseeing gave him coordinates. Very specific ones. Coordinates that pointed to a dry lakebed in Nevada. And the moment those coordinates came through, everything shifted from an experiment to something far more controlled. The launch that changed everything. The moment David Adair prepared his rocket for launch at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, the operation stopped resembling a student test and started looking like a military event. Trucks rolled in, personnel locked down the area, and every step was treated with a level of seriousness that didn't match the age of the engineer running the checklist. That's your first hint that this wasn't a normal experiment. According to Adair, his rocket wasn't traditional by any stretch. It was an experimental system built around an electromagnetic fusion containment engine, something no other teenager and barely any professional lab was attempting at the time. The rocket wasn't designed to be disposable. It was designed to be recoverable. Parachutes, reinforced airframe, systems meant to bring it down intact because the real goal wasn't height. It was performance analysis. Here's the part people never forget. Adair didn't choose the landing site. The military gave him coordinates. He didn't understand why they were so precise until much later, but those numbers pointed to a location outside the public testing grid. A dry lakebed in Nevada, Groom Lake, the place the world would eventually associate with Area 51. even though it was barely acknowledged then. The launch itself, by his account, was flawless. The rocket accelerated from 0 to thousands of miles per hour almost instantly, far beyond anything expected from a youth project. It traveled exactly where it was meant to go. And when it landed, it did so intact, exactly as designed. What happened next was fast. Instead of a routine debriefing, Adair says he was flown to Nevada. No delay, no discussion, no "good job, kid." The tone shifted from mentoring to containment. When he stepped off the aircraft, the atmosphere was nothing like White Sands. Black suits, high-ranking officers, and an unspoken message. From this point forward, his work wasn't his own. Adair's recollection of his initial moments at the base is blunt. The scale of the facility, the silence, the energy of a place where every person knows exactly what they're guarding. He could tell instantly, this wasn't a research visit. It was an assessment. He was being evaluated as much as his rocket was. And remember this, nobody brings a civilian teenager into a secured hangar unless they want to see how he reacts to whatever's inside. Inside the chamber. The moment David Adair stepped into the underground chamber, the atmosphere shifted to the unmistakable pressure of people who already knew what he was about to see. Armed personnel escorted him forward. They were showing him something they couldn't figure out themselves, and that's the only reason someone his age was even in the room. At the center of the hangar sat the engine. The first thing Adair noticed was the rupture, like the reactor had suffered a violent internal event. The second thing he noticed was movement, not mechanical movement. Something closer to pulse behavior, as if the chamber responded to environmental changes. The temperature around it shifted in gradients that didn't make sense for inert hardware. Surfaces weren't just scorched, they were textured, layered, almost biological. These weren't impressions he developed years later. These were details he documented repeatedly and consistently. He walked around it slowly, analyzing shapes and field structures the way only someone with fusion engine math burned into their head could do. The geometry was patterned. Toroidal alignments, magnetic confinement signatures, and layout cues that matched the engine design he had been developing on his own, long before anyone mentioned the name Groom Lake. Every step around the reactor increased the weight of the same realization. Whatever this thing was, its creators understood fusion containment, far beyond what the US military had. And for a few seconds, even he questioned whether he was supposed to be seeing this. At one point, he got close. Too close. The surface temperature rose sharply, not from heat, but from response, as if the reactor detected proximity. You can dismiss that. You can say sensors triggered the shift. But ask yourself this: why build a propulsion system that reacts like tissue? Why embed adaptive behavior in a device that should be strictly mechanical? Adair didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. The officers watching him were already studying his reaction more than they were studying the engine. He was the variable. He was what they were testing. The moment he identified key elements of the containment architecture, everything changed. And the people in that room reacted fast. The question was no longer what the engine was. It was why someone like him could read its design at all. Reading the code. Once David Adair stood in front of the reactor, the surprise was that it looked familiar. The structure didn't resemble any aviation hardware he'd studied. But the principles woven into it were the same ones he'd been sketching out on chalkboards for years. And that's where things get uncomfortable, because either the military had already built what he'd been chasing, or someone else had. He circled the engine slowly, not touching anything, just observing. The containment rings immediately caught his attention. They weren't decorative or random. They followed toroidal geometry, the same logic behind a magnetic bottle used to confine a fusion reaction. His own prototype used a crude version of the same idea, but this reactor's confinement architecture didn't look experimental. Think about what that means. You spend years fighting math that doesn't want to cooperate, only to see your unsolved equations applied flawlessly inside a machine that shouldn't exist. That wasn't a coincidence, and it hit him instantly. Adair leaned in just close enough to study the surface. Not metal, not composite, something else. The material had texture, micro contours that shifted temperature as he moved. It wasn't reacting like an overheated engine. It was reacting like a system that sensed its environment. Surfaces flexed in a way mechanical casings shouldn't. Nothing in his aerospace education explained that. He began mapping the logic in his head. Then a detail clicked into place. The ruptured breach in the chamber wasn't random. It looked like stress from inside, not outside. Like the engine had failed during operation, not impact. If that was true, the device had been used. And whatever used it wasn't standing in the room. This is the moment you might overlook. The government didn't need Adair to fix anything. They needed him to confirm what they already suspected, that this technology wasn't part of any human engineering lineage he knew. And when he realized just how far beyond his own work this reactor truly was, that's when the real question formed. If this wasn't built by us, then who built it? And the answer to that question comes next, because what Adair concluded in that chamber is the reason his testimony became one of the most controversial claims ever connected to Area 51. The proposal that changed the tone. The moment David Adair identified patterns inside the engine that matched his own fusion containment research, the conversation inside that underground chamber shifted. Up until then, the officers had been observing him, measuring what he recognized, watching how fast he could decode patterns that had baffled their own specialists. But once he demonstrated that he understood far more than expected, they didn't want explanations anymore. They wanted application. And what they proposed is what changed the entire tone of this story. According to Adair, high-ranking officials, men who held influence over weapons development, wanted to know if his electromagnetic fusion containment engine could be adapted for military use. Not exploration, not propulsion research, strategic deployment. That meant the possibility of weaponization, and in the Cold War climate of the early 1970s, strategic had one translation: first strike capability. This wasn't speculation on his part. Adair claimed he was directly confronted with the idea of developing a rocket fast enough to deliver a nuclear warhead in a way that would break mutual assured destruction. If that system worked, one country could strike before the enemy even detected a launch. That is the definition of destabilization. And the moment he realized what they were planning, he understood why they really wanted him at Groom Lake. But here's the part that raised the stakes even higher. He wasn't the only powerful figure involved. Adair states that former Nazi rocket engineer Arthur Rudolph, who went on to work in America's missile programs, was present during his time at the base. Rudolph had a reputation for hardline decisions and zero hesitation about technological escalation. Adair recalls Rudolph making it clear that he wasn't being given a choice. And that's when the threat surfaced, subtle in tone, unmistakable in meaning. He was told he could be kept at the base indefinitely, with his family receiving a story about an unfortunate accident. You don't ignore a threat like that. You react. And Adair reacted in the one way they didn't anticipate. He sabotaged his own rocket. Using a chemical combination, graphite grease and deuterium, he triggered a catastrophic internal failure that obliterated the engine before anyone could repurpose it. The explosion was massive. The reaction from the officials was immediate. But the weapon they wanted no longer existed. And here's where the story pivots again. According to Adair, the only reason he ever walked out of Area 51 alive was because General Curtis LeMay intervened. LeMay had known him before Groom Lake. He knew the kid wasn't a threat, unless he was forced to become one. That intervention, Adair says, shut down the push to keep him on the base permanently and got him home. But going home didn't solve anything, because once you've seen what he claimed to have seen, once you've witnessed an engine that behaves in ways no human-built reactor should, your life doesn't go back to normal. And what Adair concluded about that engine is the part of the story that refuses to disappear. It's time to tell the truth. This is where the story stops being theoretical. This is the point David Adair says everything snapped into focus, and the reason his testimony became one of the most controversial claims connected to Area 51. Because once he understood the patterns inside that reactor, once he matched them to the math he'd been wrestling with, the only conclusion he could reach was the one nobody wanted to hear. According to Adair, the engine wasn't built by any US program. It wasn't Soviet. It wasn't experimental aerospace tech. It was organic. A machine with biological characteristics woven into its structure, behaving like a living system engineered to interface with its operator. And he says that's why he recognized it. The engine wasn't meant to be piloted with hands, instruments, or switches. It was meant to link directly to the pilot's nervous system. He described it like this: it responds to emotion, to intention. It's a symbiotic engine. That line has followed him for decades, and this is where the stakes rise. Because if that statement is true, even partially, it means the propulsion system he saw wasn't just advanced. It belonged to a species capable of merging biological intelligence with high-energy fusion containment. And that's when he said it publicly. It's time to tell the truth. Adair's claim is simple but explosive. The damaged engine he examined beneath Groom Lake was, in his view, a non-human propulsion system recovered from a craft that crashed long before he ever arrived. The rupture wasn't the result of testing. It was the result of an incident. And the military wasn't trying to repair it. They were trying to understand it. And they needed someone who had independently developed fusion containment math advanced enough to recognize what they were looking at. That's where Adair fit. Not as a scientist, not as a consultant, as a decoder. He insists the engine behaved like a hybrid system, part machine, part responsive tissue. Temperature shifts matched proximity. Internal structures aligned in patterns you would expect from biological adaptation, not fabricated materials. And the deeper he analyzed it, the clearer the message became. Someone else had solved problems humanity was still stumbling through. Someone had built a reactor capable of controlling star-level plasma safely, efficiently, and intelligently. Now here's where you need to decide how far you're willing to follow this. Because every detail Adair documented points toward a technology that would reshape every field it touched. Aerospace, defense, propulsion, even medicine. If any part of this is true, you're looking at evidence that humanity wasn't just behind. It was centuries behind. And the military's next move made that gap even clearer. Because once Adair identified the engine's origins, the tone of the room changed instantly. The officers didn't want explanations. They wanted cooperation. And what they asked him to help them do next is where this story turns dangerous. But that moment, the weaponization proposal, the sabotage, the escape, that all happened because of what he saw in that chamber. And what he concluded about that engine is the reason this story still circulates today. Reverse engineering and the world built from hidden engines. Once David Adair was out of Area 51, the story didn't end. It shifted into something far broader. If you listen closely to how he describes the decades that followed, you'll notice a pattern. He keeps pointing to technology jumps that seem to arrive faster than the supporting infrastructure could explain. And according to him, that's not a coincidence. It's fallout. The kind that happens when breakthroughs don't emerge from research labs, but from recovered hardware. Adair argues that some modern advancements appeared too complete when they debuted, almost as if they were scaled-down versions of something much more advanced. And the documents show he wasn't theorizing from the sidelines. He spent years inside industries applying transferable aerospace concepts to practical civilian tech. He worked in areas that dealt directly with materials engineering, safety systems, and telemetry derived from spaceflight. Take materials science. One example he often cites is the development of superabsorbent polymers, technology that eventually helped create modern, disposable diapers. On its own, that sounds mundane. But Adair links it to work descending from high-performance aerospace materials designed to manage fluid retention and pressure environments. Not alien tech, just tech born out of aerospace principles, which themselves, he suggests, may have originated from something far more advanced. Then there's medical telemetry. Adair talks about how space-based vitals monitoring, the kind used to track astronauts' heart rates, oxygen levels, and stress responses, later evolved into portable medical systems used in hospitals, ambulances, and even wearables today. The part he emphasizes is the acceleration. These systems matured fast. Too fast. And that kind of acceleration, he says, looks exactly like what happens when engineers start reverse engineering concepts instead of inventing them from scratch. He also connected dots between his own engine research and the wider leaps happening around him. Fusion containment became a hot topic. AI development surged. Autonomous systems advanced far faster than predicted. You don't have to agree with his interpretation, but you can't ignore the timeline he lays out. Humanity jumped in capability repeatedly, in very short intervals. According to him, it was like watching society build the scaffolding it needed, just so someone could drop another layer of tech on top. Now, here's the part many people overlook, and you might have too. Adair never claims every breakthrough came from Groom Lake. What he does claim is that the engine he saw, the one he says was partly organic, represented a perfect blueprint for what advanced propulsion and AI could eventually become. A system that doesn't just compute but adapts, learns, interacts. And once a program gains access to even fragments of something like that, the ripple effect doesn't stay inside a hangar. It radiates outward, quietly shaping the devices, tools, and infrastructure that end up in your hands. So here's the question Adair keeps circling back to. If something that advanced existed decades ago, how much of our world today is already influenced by technology we were never supposed to see? And that question brings us to the final chapter, because whether you believe his story or not, the pattern he describes has one thing working in its favor: it has never changed. Between belief and skepticism. Here's the reason David Adair's account refuses to disappear. He has never changed it, not once. For decades, the details have stayed the same. The timeline is the same. The people he names, Ashbrook, LeMay, Rudolph, are historical figures with documented roles in aerospace and weapons development. You don't have to believe the engine to acknowledge the resume. There are no released documents verifying a living engine under Groom Lake. No photographic evidence. No official acknowledgement. Skeptics point out that reverse engineering alien technology requires extraordinary evidence, and Adair hasn't provided that publicly. The government's official stance frames Area 51 as a test site for aircraft, not recovered craft. All of that is fair. But the other side is the pattern. Count the aerospace engineers, physicists, and military insiders across decades who've hinted at technology leaps that didn't match the published research curve. Count the testimonies, some credible, some questionable, that follow a familiar structure: a recovered craft, a non-terrestrial engine, a push for weaponization. Adair's story fits a template that existed long before he went public. And here's where people tend to pause. He doesn't claim he was chosen because he was special. He claims he was chosen because he was useful. A teenager with fusion math advanced enough to identify what others couldn't. That detail grounds the story in a way more sensational accounts never manage. And when challenged, he repeats the same phrase: "It's time to tell the truth." Whether you interpret that as courage, conviction, or something more complicated depends entirely on you. If David Adair really stood in front of a living, fusion-powered engine that wasn't built by human hands, then what else might be hiding behind the classified walls of the world's most secure facilities? And if he didn't, why does his story feel so difficult to dismiss? David Adair reveals the truth as he understands it, and how he cracked the code behind engineering spacecrafts at Area 51 remains one of the most persistent accounts in the history of classified aerospace research. Whether that truth matches reality is something you'll have to decide for yourself. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.